Good afternoon, students. Once again, this is an unusual, I suppose, teaching situation. I'm meeting with you on Sunday afternoon, and this will be our first lecture for English 2332. And what I want to do is give you a kind of introduction to the Odyssey. You see on my table my statue of Odysseus and his faithful companion Argus, whom you're going to read about in the Odyssey. By now, I would think that some of you will have taken your exam on the Iliad. Others of you should finish now by tomorrow, by 5 o'clock. If there are any aberrations or irregularities dealing with Blackboard in terms of the test, I'll make appropriate corrections. And probably from now on, I will largely use, if you will, email. I think that's going to work a little better. And several of my colleagues have also expressed that they're having a bit better success with using email. So once again, I encourage you. We're facing a very difficult time, and please rest assured that I think all of this will turn out well. So let me begin with you. I'm going to give about a 20, maybe 25-minute video discussion of background and introduction, if you will, to the Odyssey. Remember, we spent a great deal of time, in fact, much of the semester on the Iliad, and we concluded chapter 24 with the funeral of Hector. Now, in order to get to the Odyssey, there is what is called a mythological interval between the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's some information that you will need to know in order to appreciate the Odyssey. Also, I call your attention to this information for this reason. It's going to give proof that Homer himself wrote both poems. Critics have sometimes said that perhaps Homer wrote only one because of the difference in subject matter. But I do want you to remember, I told you that the overall, shall we say, frame theme of the Iliad was the picture of war. That picture changes considerably when we get to the Odyssey. It is not going to present a picture of war. In fact, it's going to be, for all purposes, an opportunity to obtain, it's about peace. And it's about, one thing, domestic, shall we say, relationships. So the subject matter is going to be quite different. So will be the statue, if you will, of the hero. Now, just to refresh you a bit, remember the Iliad ends, as I said a moment ago, with the funeral of Hector. We're celebrating a heroic individual. Even in the face of death, this moment affirms the value of life. And Homer shows, I think, most carefully this moment of reconciliation of the hero back into his society. And of course, here I'm speaking clearly of Achilles. Now, you remember in the beginning, as we had begun the Iliad, we had a kind of, shall I put it this way, ego-driven hero who placed a great deal of emphasis on his honor, on his public reputation. All of that changes and did change in the course of the Iliad. So by the time that Achilles faces his moment of crisis, his moment of loss, and enters into his period of suffering, he becomes an entirely different individual. You remember, he has matured, and in suffering he has become much more, shall we say, self-controlled. Very importantly, this was brought about through what I had explained to you in terms of the Iliad, his Rite of Passage. Now, in many myths and in many works, The hero's rite of passage is very literal. He goes on a physical journey. In fact, this is one of the, shall I say, prevailing motifs of the Odyssey. It is the idea of the hero going on a journey. He undergoes what I will call the Rite of Quest. He's in search, if you will, of something. So when I say that the Rite of Passage is literal, you will find that this will be true in the Odyssey. Literally, Odysseus will go to the underworld. This will be his rite of passage. This must happen before he's going to be allowed to go back home. Now, after undergoing his journey to the underworld, his journey, if you will, to Hades, he's going to return with a knowledge that he has not had before. Now, we talked about when we in class about the Iliad, the rite of passage, remember, for Achilles was psychological. And I explained that moment to you when Patroclus has come to him, and you remember the idea is that he had forgotten to bury Patroclus, and Patroclus tells him that he has this obligation. Now, the next step in this background, you remember some of you were mistaken to think that the Iliad was going to end with the death of Achilles. This is not true. This is part of this interval that I'm explaining to you. In time, Achilles is eventually killed at the gates of Troy by an arrow in the heel. You remember when I gave you the background at the beginning of the semester, I told you the story about Achilles' mother wanting to make Achilles protective, and she took him to the sacred river Styx, dipped him into it, holding him by his heel, and he was not covered with the sacred water in that spot. All right, this becomes that, shall we say, weakness, physical weakness in character. Achilles is shot with the aid of Apollo. Paris was hiding behind the city walls, and the arrow penetrates the heel of Achilles, and Achilles dies. His corpse, and you remember we talked about in the Iliad, the new armor, his corpse will be rescued by Odysseus and by another warrior that we had mentioned when we talked about the embassy scene. You remember the warrior Ajax. The ashes of Achilles are buried in the golden urn together with the ashes of Patroclus. Now, there will be a discussion as to who's going to get the armor of Achilles. There are two contenders. One contender, obviously, is going to be Odysseus, and the other is Ajax. Now, the Trojan prisoners, those who were taken as prisoners, very much liked Odysseus because he treated them with a degree of respect, recognized them as being true warriors, even though they were on the opposite side. So there is a discussion between Odysseus and Ajax. And you remember from our discussion in the Iliad, one of the marked characteristics showing the prominence of Odysseus as a leader was his ability to talk, his ability to articulate, his ability to reason. And what you find is here he can outsmart Ajax and make a very convincing case that he deserves the armor, if you will, of Achilles. Ajax is most upset, will momentarily go insane, and actually will commit suicide. Now, I mention this to you for this reason. Odysseus, when he goes to the underworld, will have to spend, if you will, a bit of time seeing those who've actually fought in the Trojan War and who are now obviously dead and have gone to Hades. One such soul will be Ajax. This is going to be a very sobering moment, if you will, between the two, because Ajax still holds a kind of grudge against Odysseus for having gotten the armor, if you will, of Achilles. Now, as I continue this mythological background, we have to deal with the character of Paris. The gods dictated that Paris can only be killed by one character, and we know nothing about him. He was actually not mentioned in terms of the Iliad, but as I said, this is part of the background. His name is Philoctetes, Philoctetes, and he had been left on an island when the Greeks were making their way, if you will, to Troy. And in the interest of time, I won't particularly relate this story, but what's going to happen is that he will be brought back from this island. And remember, he's been there since the war has been going on for 10 years. He will be brought back and he will be told that he will have to fight and he will kill Paris. Now, what's very important is that Troy will fall, but it's not going to happen in terms of some kind of military conquest. Troy is going to fall because of Odysseus' ability to be, if you will, clever. In a sense, his ability to be somewhat deceitful, and his ability, if you will, to trick the Trojans to some extent. So what I want you to see, you remember we had been told from time to time in the Iliad how resourceful, how clever Odysseus had been. So what's to happen? And it's time for this war to end. People want to get back home. They're tired of fighting, so forth. So it is Odysseus who comes up with the idea of how to end the Trojan War. So I had explained to you when we discussed the Iliad, the only way to defeat the Trojans was to get inside the gates of Troy. All right, Odysseus then devises this scheme. He decides to build what is called the Trojan Horse, and he will park the horse outside the gates of Troy. And there is a character, a Greek named Sinon, Sinon, and he's very, very loyal to Odysseus. In fact, some even go so far as to say that there's a kind of, shall we say, physical relationship on the part of this character in terms of his feelings for Odysseus. And Odysseus has told him to allow the Trojans to capture him, and he's to tell them that he has deserted the Greeks and wants to come on the side of the Trojans. And also part of the scheme, as the Trojans look out, they can see some of the ships making sail, perhaps making sail to go back home. So this character tells him, or tells the Trojans, I should say, that this is an offering and they should take it into the city because the horse is an indication that the war will be over. Well, you may remember the story to some extent. What has happened in terms, and if you will, go online and you can see a picture of the Trojan horse. It's a gigantic, very awesome figure. And what happens inside the, shall I say, belly of the horse are hidden Greek warriors. And what's to happen, and once the horse is brought inside the city, the Trojans celebrate, thinking that the war, for all purposes, the war is over. This is a time of celebration. And what's to happen then, after a night of celebration, they fall asleep, and this character, along with Helen, will open the door on the underside of the horse, and all of the Greek warriors of importance will scale down and kill the Trojans. Now, one character that I may have alluded to when we had begun the discussion of the Iliad was a character named Cassandra. Cassandra is a daughter of the king of Troy, and she very much was interested at a time. Apollo, I should put it this way, was interested in her, and he made a deal with her. He said, if you will, how can I put it tactfully, if you will be interested in me, I will give you a gift. And she professed to be interested. So he gives her the gift of prophecy. Now, when it came time for Cassandra, shall I say, to respect the offer, she had a change of heart. But what happens is, once a god has given a mortal a gift, he can't take it back. So he had given her the gift of prophecy, but he puts a kind of curse on this gift. He says, you will always tell the truth, but nobody is going to believe you. So Cassandra is there. She has been, and for all purposes, she is going to say, along with the priest, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. And the old priest takes a spear, and he will aim the spear at the underside of the horse. And if there had not been so much noise on the part of the Trojans celebrating what they considered to be the end of the war, they would have heard all of the armor, all of the swords make a rattle, but they didn't. So no one paid any attention to poor Cassandra. She was telling the truth. And Athena then sends a serpent to kill the priest, who also was making the warning. So, in short, what's to happen is the Trojans are defeated, and the Greeks are victorious, and they're going to make their way home. Now remember, and I say this as a kind of, if you will, review moment, remember that one Trojan has remained alive, and there are others, of course, but this one is most important. His name is Aeneas, and the idea is that he will now make his way from the ruins of Troy, and eventually, in time, we have the founding of the new civilization, which will be Rome. Now, all of these significant Greeks are making their way home. I should tell you now, Helen will be united back with Menelaus. After all, Paris is dead. So really, there's nothing really left for her, and Menelaus is eager, and you're going to read about that moment, if you will, in the Odyssey. So the significant Greeks really are making their way home. The one who will get home first is Agamemnon, and he is taken as his concubine, Cassandra. And when he gets back home, he will be met by his wife And you remember in reading the Iliad, her name is Clytemnestra, and she has not, while he's been away, been probably that faithful to him, just as he probably has not been that faithful to her. And what happens when Agamemnon returns home, he actually will tell Clytemnestra, you take my concubine in and give her a bath. And you can imagine how Clytemnestra will want to react, but she becomes a subject of a very important play called Agamemnon. She remains pretty cool, and she smiles and says, by all means. Now she's going to remember Agamemnon has not always been this smart, and he still is beset by this sense of, if you will, hubris. And in order to trap him and win a kind of victory, if you will, from the gods and say, I'm right, she has put before him a piece of tapestry, and she tells him that he's going to have to walk on it in order to get into the house. Well, momentarily he knows that he shouldn't, because this is reserved for the gods, but his pride will get the best of him. And she reminds him, she says, you're victorious. You have won the Trojan War. You're the leader. And she says, what if things had been reversed? What if Priam had won the war? What do you think he would have done? And Agamemnon, without thinking, says, walk on this piece of tapestry. And she smiles. He does so. And then later, Clytemnestra, some say, along with her lover, will kill Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Now, so that there would not be any kind of interruption of this event, Helen and Menelaus also making their way home, but a storm ensues and delays them. So what I'm trying to show you here is we have a post-war world struggling, in a sense, to return to a kind of state, if you will, of what we can define as being normal. And what we've got to do now, and as you've studied history, you likely will know this, there has to be an opportunity to create a new world order. And this, in a sense, is what we're going to find out in terms of the Odyssey. All you have to do is think about, in terms of your reading history, go back and read about the aftermath, if you will, of, shall I say, World War II. Now, Odysseus, which we will find out in reading the Odyssey, makes a mistake and will not be allowed to return home because the gods, if you will, have a plan for him. He's not ready to come back home yet, because if he does, he will fall victim to what's happening as you're reading Book 1 of the Odyssey. So he, even though he has been very clever, very resourceful, the gods feel that he's not ready to return home. Now my point to you here is, he will have to wander another 10 years before he can get back home. So, the total lapse for Odysseus has been 20 years he's been away from his home in Ithaca. You remember I gave you the background of Odysseus. You remember that he never wanted to fight in the Trojan War in the first place. All he wanted to do was to stay back home in Ithaca. But he was forced to go into and fight in the Trojan War. And you remember, he left behind that infant son. His name is Telemachus or Telemachus. Either pronunciation is correct. Now, 20 years later, that young man has grown, and when you read Book 1 of the Odyssey, you see him, a young man, thinking about what he hopes to be the return of his father. Now, you're going to have to read about conditions, if you will, in terms of what's going on in Ithaca. Now, I told you that I'm going to give 2 segments, and I'm already about 25 minutes into my discussion. So what I'm going to do now, as I said, I want to break this, and I want to make this point. I'm going to give you even more specific background about the Odyssey. And what I want to do with you a bit is this. I want you to know as you begin the Odyssey, and as I said, you're likely reading either the prose translation, or you may be, for all purposes, reading the portions in your anthology. I'm going to respect the anthology. Now, the anthology is not going to be complete. It's not going to have all 24 books. But I will provide enough information in such a way that if you don't have the paperback, you will still be okay. So I begin with this question, as I had begun in terms of the Iliad. Once again, as we look at the Odyssey, it too is an epic poem. All of the conventions that I spent probably 2 class periods explaining to you about epic poetry will mostly apply to the Odyssey as well. Now, remember I talked to you, and I said that anytime you read a great piece of literature, there is always what is called the beginning, middle, and end. And I said that for all purposes, we begin the work with a disruption of order. Order very much is violated in the Odyssey. Well, just as we looked in terms of the Iliad. What's got to happen is we've got to have a restoration of that order. And that will happen when we finish Book 24 of the Odyssey. Now, the subject matter, the character delineation, all of that is going to be quite different. But in order to explain this idea of plot formation and the idea of this disruption of order, remember I always explain it, or have explained it on, there's a disruption on 3 levels. One level is a religious disruption. Religious order is disrupted by what you're reading about in Book 1 of the Odyssey. There is a violation on the part of these suitors who have taken over the homeland of Odysseus and are occupying it. They don't have that right to. They violated what is called, you remember, hospitality. So the gods are unhappy, and for other reasons. And there will be that violation of political order. Now, if you look in terms of what's going on in Ithaca, we don't have a definable, shall we say, leader or ruler. Telemachus is too young to be king of Ithaca. In fact, by right, he's not king of Ithaca. There is the father of Odysseus, who is the king of Ithaca, but remember, he's in almost a kind of mourning for his son, and he has sort of overlooked some of his duties as ruler, and Odysseus is not present. Eventually, he will become king of Ithaca once he comes back and will restore order. So political order very much is violated. And then you have domestic/social order violated because you clearly in this work have a problem in personal relationships, sort of like you had in terms of the Iliad regarding, you remember, the relationship between husband, wife, son. Look, you remember about Hector, Andromache, and their young son? Well, here you have the same thing. You have a problem in a domestic relationship between the wife of Odysseus, Penelope, and their young son too, not the infant by any means. He's about 19, 20 years old. But as years go by, the notion is, will Odysseus ever return home? And Penelope is thinking, well, what do I do with the rest of my life? So clearly, she very much loves Odysseus, but the notion is he ever going to return? Well, it's now 30 minutes into my discussion, and I'm going to pause here. And what I want you to do is, once you find out when you could view this video, do so. And then I'm going to have a second video in which I will deal with, shall I say, specific themes that you should look at in terms of the Odyssey. And by then, we should have dealt with the first exam. And what I'm going to do at the end of my second video, I'm going to present some questions that I will want you to answer over the Odyssey. And I'll explain how to handle this. Right now, all I want you to do is to continue your reading and remain calm and do the best that you can under these very, very trying circumstances. So I will conclude this first video, and we will continue later. Have a good afternoon. Okay,